This week, our chapter is over interest groups and lobbyists. And so these are the two groups that get probably the worst rap when it comes to the political process. Now, it's a deserved reputation, but these also can be beneficial for the people as well. So we're going to look at it, kind of from both sides. Next to political parties, interest groups and lobbyists probably have, um, you know, the strongest amount of influence over, um, our elected officials besides the public. So, and unfortunately, like we said, money comes into play, and money, our political system, unfortunately, money has too much of an influence in our system. So, we're going to look at how these interest groups and lobbyists work to influence our elected officials. So, first, we'll just define what interest groups are. Interest groups are formal organizations of individuals seeking to influence government for a common cause. So that definition, it makes them sound benign, and they can be, but they also can be very influential through whether it depends on who they are representing. So we're going to take a look at a few groups here in a minute. And we've talked about this kind of through the semester, but James Madison, if we look at, James Madison was one of our founding fathers, and we talked about this in our Q&A sessions. James Madison wrote about the mischief of factions. And so factions was the word they used back then. Today, that could mean political parties, interest groups, a lot of different things in our system. But what he worried about was, these groups outside of government trying to influence our elected officials could, take importance away from the voice of the people. But he believed in this idea called the pluralist theory that there would be so many groups competing for the attention of government that no one group would be able to become too powerful. Essentially, they would be kept in check because there would be so many of them. And it's true to an extent, but unfortunately, we know that when it comes to things like corporations and things like that, they have far more money to spend in our political system than the average voter. So, unfortunately, it may be true that no one of them has the most influence over government, but together they do have a lot of influence and maybe more influence than they should have. There are a couple of other theories, and we talked about these towards the beginning of the semester: elite theory and transactional theory. Elite theory kind of says that groups with greater resources are in a better position to accomplish their goals. So, the more money you have, the more resources you have at your disposal, whether it is, spending money on campaigns and elections or spending money on promoting a candidate or an idea, whatever that is, that the more resources you have, you put yourself in a better position to be successful. Transactional theory is kind of the idea that public policy, law, things like that can be bought and sold like a commodity to the highest bidder. So essentially, for our elected officials to, create a bill or a policy or something like that, there has to be something in it for them, and that those with greater resources, can essentially persuade them to, uh, you know, enact legislation favorable to them. So, and then I just ask a question down here at the bottom: which of these theories do you think best describes Texas? So, I'll leave that up to you. That could be a starting point for a discussion post right there. If you look over on the right, this is kind of a joke. I think it was Stephen Colbert who originally talked about this. But there's this idea that because our elected officials receive so much outside money in different ways, that maybe their suits should look kind of like a NASCAR driver's suit, so we know who all they are taking money from and whose interests they are working in. There's only supposed to be one group of people's interest they're working in, and that's the American people. But unfortunately, because of the way money is allowed into our system, corporations are seen as having the same rights as people. And we'll talk about that in a minute. So there's two main types of interest groups that we're going to talk about. Private interest groups are exactly what they sound like, advocate on the behalf of their members. So for a private interest group, you typically have to belong to this specific type of group. A public interest group is at a much greater disadvantage. A public interest group, they work for issues that benefit everyone. So, a private interest group, a good example here would be some type of business association, a group that you pay membership dues to, things like that. Public interest group would be someone who, say, advocates for the environment or clean drinking water or public health, those things that are public goods. But the problem is, with the problem with public interest groups is what we call the free rider problem. When public interest groups are successful in lobbying government, we all benefit from them being successful, whether we contributed to the fight that they had, whether we contributed to a group working on that issue. We all benefit. If we're, say, advocating for clean drinking water or clean air, there's no way to restrict that from someone who didn't help in the fight for clean air and clean water. We all benefit, hence it being called a public good. When it comes to those types of issues, it's actually much harder to get people involved because they reap the benefits whether they do anything or not. Private interest groups have the advantage of having access to more money because they have members who contribute to that particular cause. And they also have the benefit of selective benefits, which are, privileges they can give to people who contribute to work for that cause. And we'll look at those in a minute as well. Now, what are interest groups, or are you aware of any interest groups? These are some of the ones that you may be aware of, probably some of the most well known. Probably the one that every student, if I say, tell me the name of an interest group, the NRA is always the first one that is mentioned. The NRA, National Rifle Association, is an advocacy group for gun ownership, the Second Amendment, sometimes at the detriment of the American people. They used to have a lot of influence. Their influence has waned a bit simply because they are having financial issues as an organization. But if you are a member of the NRA, you pay membership dues to be a part of that organization. In return, they do give their members discount programs on firearms, on gun range fees. One of my students in the past has told me that if your firearm is ever stolen and used in a crime, they will provide you with legal protection as well. So there's benefits for being a member. You pay membership dues, and then that money is what is used to lobby Congress and things like that for issues that the NRA cares about. PETA is another kind of well-known, sometimes reviled group. They are people for the ethical treatment of animals, and they are a radical activist group. Their cause being, advocating for a vegan lifestyle and advocating against the mistreatment of animals. And they have some very radical methods that they use. I think I have some photos and stuff of some of their protests that we'll look at. The ACLU, the American Civil Liberties Union, they are a group of legal professionals that excuse me, that advocate for your civil liberties. And if they believe that government, or whether it's the federal government, state governments, are acting against the civil liberties of American citizens, they will use their team of attorneys to file court cases. They have been a party to many important Supreme Court decisions. Like in the Loving case, where the ban on interracial marriage was struck down. The ACLU is who represented the Loving couple. They've advocated for gay marriage. They've advocated for any kind of progressive issue. So they are definitely a more kind of left leaning group. The Sierra Club is an environmental protection type group. The AMA, the American Medical Association, they represent the interest of doctors and medical professionals. The AARP, the American Association for Retired Persons, they represent the issues that are really important to people over the age of 65. So these are some of the interest groups that you may have heard of or may be familiar with. Sorry, y'all, my computer's running kind of slow. I don't know why. So first, we'll look at some of the professional or the private organizations. There's a few kind of associations that represent different things. The trade association and the professional association. These are groups that represent the interest of specific businesses and specific uh, professions that people practice. The Retail Trade Association more represents particular fields of business. But we'll look at the trade associations. So groups such as Texas Oil and Gas Association, Good Roads Transportation Association, Texas Farm Bureau, Texas Farmers Union. These are all tied to a particular trade. And when we talk about a trade, we're typically talking about a field of work that you learn through practice. You don't necessarily have to have a college degree. So like the Texas Oil and Gas Association would advocate not only for oil and gas, but also for oil and gas workers, people who are out there in the field, working on rigs and things like that. Texas Farm Bureau, Texas Farmers Union represent the interest of farmers. These are professions that kind of are generational, and if your dad was one, you're likely to be one. Your grandpa may have been one. Those kind of jobs is what we're talking about. The difference with the professional association is that these are jobs where you typically have to have some type of special education and a license to practice. So, doctors, lawyers, engineers, cosmetologists, nurses, things like that, where you are getting either a degree or you're going through school to learn that particular field, and then you have to maintain a license to practice those professions as well. We talked about the AMA, the American Medical Association. They represent doctors, and so they also get involved in political issues, like when President Obama's administration passed the Affordable Care Act. The American Medical Association actually lobbied against it because they believed it would cut into the amount of money that doctors would be able to make. So they are going to advocate for their field and how legislation and policy is going to affect their field above all else. Retail trade associations represent entire groups of people practicing the same business. They get involved in, like let's say that, we're raising the sales tax. A retail trade association may be lobbying against that because they don't want it to hurt the sales of their products or those types of issues. Some of the ones that we have here in the state, the Texas Apartment Association. If you ever lease an apartment, it's like an association that all the apartments join, and they are kind of represented collectively. If you ever pay attention to the lease that you sign, their logo is almost always at the top. Texas Automobile Dealer Association, Beer Alliance of Texas. A few years ago, there was this issue between all of these breweries that are popping up in Texas and the government, because we had rules on the books that wouldn't allow breweries to sell their products directly. They had to go through a third party distributor to sell their product. And so the Beer Alliance and some other retail trade associations actually got legislation passed to strike down that rule. So now when you go to a brewery, you can buy a six pack or a case directly from the brewery. That used to not be the case. So that's the example of like the influence a retail trade association can have. There's one more that's very well known, but kind of straddles the line, and that is the Texas State Teachers Association. They are it's one of the oldest and largest in the state and is affiliated with the National Education Association. And they are a professional association and a union. And so, professional association and unions, they are essentially, they also organize their workers in such a way to advocate for better benefits and treatment. And if they do not get the response they like, they can take collective action, like going on strike and things like that. So they also advocate for better education standards. What teachers would like to see going on in the classroom. You can guarantee right now that they're on the forefront of you know kids going back to school because of COVID and advocating for the interest of teachers. So they are one of the few unions that still have some influence in Texas. A lot of unions have been done away with. We'll talk about unions as well here on this slide. If you don't know what a union is, unions used to have a lot of influence in our country, but they've been kind of marginalized. But unions are professional groups that allow employees in a certain field to come together and do what is called collective bargaining. This is where everyone in a field is negotiating with, the employers of their field to over things like working conditions, wages, hours, safety conditions, all that kind of stuff. And so, like we were talking about with the teachers, there's been a few I don't know if it's been this decade or the previous decade, where teachers felt they were being underpaid, so they went on strike. We see this with airline workers quite a bit. There's not a lot of there's not a lot of unions that have a lot of influence in Texas because Texas is very much an anti-union state. But if you go up to like the Midwest, the old industrial states like Michigan and Wisconsin and places like that, unions are still pretty strong up there. Um, in Texas, we have passed some laws to kind of take power away from the unions. Um, Only about 4.5% of Texans belong to a union, the most of whom work in petrochemical processing down on the coast, like around Houston, teachers' unions, and then, of course, airlines because they are kind of more national than just centered in one state. But this is kind of what I was talking about at the beginning of the semester, where Texas is very much a business friendly state, sometimes to the detriment of the Texas worker. Um, Texas definitely sides more with the corporations themselves, and so um, because they get a lot of economic benefit from large corporations that they don't get as much from protecting the interest of workers. One of the biggest blows to unions in Texas was what we call right to work laws. And a right to work laws essentially state that union membership cannot be required to work. So if you go to some other states, if you want to work in, say, auto manufacturing, like you want to work for Chevy or Ford or whoever building cars, you have to join a union. Texas has laws that stop that say that anybody can work in any profession without having to join a union. And so that reduces the number of people in a union because you have to pay dues to be part of a union. And some people are going to say, well, I don't want to pay anything out of my check to be part of a union, just pay me my full salary. And that reduces the number of people who are in a union. The auto industry is one where people still are heavily unionized in Texas. They just cannot require you to join the union. But they also essentially allow employers to terminate you for any reason in the state of Texas, any reason the employer deems appropriate, and they do not have to give you an explanation. So this is something that y'all should be aware of as, adults who will be, if you're not working already, who will be working. In Texas, employees have very little protection from being terminated. And if you feel you have been wronged by an employer in the state, it is a very difficult thing to take that to court to prove. So the favor goes to the employer in Texas, not the employee. And so that's something you have to be cognizant about. And so this is why it's difficult for other fields to unionize, especially like retail workers. There's always been this push for retail workers to unionize for better treatment. But the moment, like if Walmart is one of the worst, if you try to unionize a Walmart, they will just fire everybody who's trying to unionize. And right to work laws give them the right to do that. There's a video here about kind of the history of unions in our country. I definitely recommend that you watch that. It's pretty short, but it kind of gives you an overview of what unions have done historically and kind of where they're at today. And then we have a few other classifications of interest groups here that are built more around activism. So first is our identity groups. Identity groups are the ones that you belong to, or you can belong to because of some inherent quality about yourself. So the most well known is the NAACP, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. And obviously, colored people is an outdated term, but that's what NAACP stands for, and they never change that. So, but the NAACP has had a historic influence in this country. They have been a part of, so many of the important decisions, Brown versus Board of Education that strikes down Jim Crow, and just advocating for the rights of African American citizens. And so they form in the early 1900s. I think it's around like 1901, somewhere around there. And they decide, to start using the court system to advocate for the protection of rights of African Americans. And they've had a lot of success. A lot of scholars have come out of the NAACP. The NAACP was responsible for founding, kind of the historically black colleges and university system to produce more black scholars to advance the cause of African Americans. So their model has been, copied by other groups. Like the next one is LULAC. LULAC stands for the League of United Latin American Citizens, and they have done the same thing for Latinos. The next one, the HRC, you may be familiar with, the Human Rights Campaign. They advocate for LGBT issues. And so many of them follow the same model as the NAACP, where they use, you can join them, you can donate to them. If you fall in one of those categories, you can contact them if you feel you have been wronged. And sometimes they will provide you with legal representation and things like that. So those are identity groups. You belong to them no matter what. If you contact them because you need help, they will listen. As long as you fall in one of those categories, as far as your identity. Single issue groups are groups that form around an issue that they are very passionate about. Some examples here. MAD, Mothers Against Drunk Driving. NOW, the National Organization of Women. That one, maybe I should put that one in the identity groups, actually. They were very active in they're still around, I believe, but they were very active in the 60s and 70s. They were a big part of the push for, women's healthcare rights, pro-choice organization, things like that, feminism. ACLU, American Civil Liberties Union. Their issue is civil liberties, protecting American civil liberties. National Right to Life Committee, a pro-life group. Sierra Club is an environmental group. These groups are very passionate about a particular issue or things that are connected to that issue. So the NRA would be another group that would fall in here. And so people who are very motivated about these issues typically join these groups, pay membership dues, help advocate for their cause, maybe generate email lists, contact people, try and convince them to vote for certain candidates during an election season. And then we have our religious groups, Christian Coalition of America, Interreligious Sponsoring Organization. There's a few more that have a lot of influence in politics, even though religion isn't really supposed to be advocating for political causes because they are tax exempt. There are religious interest groups and lobbyists and things like that who are trying to get our elected officials to essentially, legislate morality. That is kind of what these groups do. Non-membership groups. These are probably the most well known of these are political action committees. Political action committees are the ones that have so much influence in our election system. They essentially are formed around a particular candidate or a particular party or a particular issue that's big in an election to raise money to give to candidates that support that particular point of view. There are limits on the amount of money that an individual can give to a candidate. So, what political action committees do is they take money from everyone and then they can spend it on candidates as long as they don't coordinate with them. So, they can buy their own political ads, their own yard signs, that do their own political work, but they cannot coordinate with the candidate themselves. So, it allows for even more money and influence in the political system with this little loophole that you don't coordinate with the candidate themselves. And then there are interest groups within government, things like the Texas Police Association, groups that are advocating for people who do a particular kind of work in government, because even those people have to lobby the legislature as well. Police unions have gotten a lot of attention lately, negative attention for the way that they protect their own, even when there's been wrongdoing and things like that. The police association advocates for tougher criminal justice punishment. They are not in favor of criminal justice reform. So they are heavily criticized for the amount of influence they have, more so sometimes than the people, about issues surrounding criminal justice. Other ones include Texas Municipal League. This is a group. Towns can join this to advocate for issues that are important to them. Combined Law Enforcement Association of Texas, Texas Association of Firefighters, Texas Association of Counties. These are all groups that take their causes to the legislature and lobby for legislation as well. Now, techniques used by interest groups. How are they successful? Well, the most well known is lobbying. Lobbying is at its core, lobbying is just the practice of trying to influence members of the legislature. And it's called lobbying because originally they would have people who would try and catch legislators in the lobby of the Capitol and talk to them about particular issues, try and get them to support certain legislation, things like that. And most people wouldn't have a problem with that. Where people are uncomfortable with lobbying is when money starts to get involved. Um, but actions that constitute lobbying: one, contacting members of the legislature by any method to express support or opposition for legislation. If you're someone who cares about politics, you may have done this already. You may have sent an email, called a legislator's office, things like that. Technically, that makes you a lobbyist. But again, most people don't have a problem with that type of lobbying because it doesn't involve any money. Convincing members to file a particular bill, working with members to draft legislation, testifying before Congress about legislation, encouraging interest groups to contact legislators, issuing press releases and buying ads. See, now we're starting to get into money. And then providing written material to members of the legislature to try and educate them on your point of view. If you look over here, now this list is a little old, but I think it's still pretty accurate. Um, this is the amount of money spent on federal lobbying from 1998 to 2014. By like far and away, the group that spent the most amount is the Chamber of Commerce. If you're not aware of what the Chamber of Commerce does, it represents the interest of small businesses. So your mom and pop businesses around town, if your parents owned a small business, you may be aware of the Chamber of Commerce. Most small businesses will join the Chamber of Commerce and they pay membership dues and things like that to be a part of it. And essentially, what the Chamber of Commerce does, one is they promote local businesses, like your city's Chamber of Commerce is trying to convince people to come and spend money in your town. But the big Chamber of Commerce organization, what they do is, they take the resources of all these small businesses and pull them together to have influence to lobby for issues that are important to small businesses. If you're a corporation like Apple or Amazon or someone like that, you don't need this because Amazon's worth like billions of dollars, so they have enough money to lobby for themselves. But if you're like a barbershop or a little mom and pop shop on Main Street, you don't have money to spend on lobbying for issues that are important to you. But the Chamber of Commerce allows those people to pool their resources to have more influence. The rest, as you can see, are some of the groups we talked about and businesses. The American Medical Association, General Electric, National Association of Realtors, American Hospital Association, Pharma, AARP. So a lot of these are issue groups and businesses, and they are lobbying against the interest of the people sometimes. You can imagine that ExxonMobil is probably not lobbying for better environmental protection. That's just the way things go. And unfortunately, they have more money than most voters. So there's a few different types of lobbyists. One are the ones that we tend to hate: professional hired lobbyists. These are people who make in the millions of dollars every year to lobby for a specific, field or a specific client, and they are paid anywhere from hundreds of thousands of dollars to millions of dollars to represent their client. And some of the best lobbyists are former legislators. So when a politician loses an election or decides to retire, they are uniquely qualified to become a lobbyist because they already know how the political system works. They already have connections in Congress, so they can be very successful at this. And many of them will step down from Congress and become lobbyists because it is far more lucrative than being a legislator. Not everybody is a former politician, but a lot of them are. In-house lobbyists, a lot of corporations keep lobbyists on staff as a paid employee that they send to the Capitol whenever they need someone there lobbying for a particular issue. Governmental lobbyists, these are lobbyists employed by different agencies and within the legislature to try and lobby other parts of government to take certain action. Citizen and volunteer lobbyists. This is what you would be if you are advocating for an issue you care about. Like recently, there's been a lot of people who are advocating for contacting their senators, saying that President Trump shouldn't fill Ruth Bader Ginsburg's seat, that should go to whoever wins the election. So, in simply that, if you have emailed your congressperson, your senator, whoever, you have become a lobbyist. And so, the citizen and volunteer lobbyists are people who are doing this simply because they care about something. They're not being paid; they are volunteering their time to do it. And then private individuals working on a pet project or issue. This would be usually they're very wealthy people, someone like Bill Gates or Tom Steyer, who was lobbying for impeaching President Trump back as early as like 2016. Wealthy individuals who are putting their time and their effort and their money towards a particular issue. The revolving door is what we talked about. That is when people step down from their government positions and then become lobbyists. Electioneering is when interest groups try to engage and influence the outcome of elections. So, a good example of this would be like the NRA. Each year, the NRA puts out what's called they call it their report card, and they give politicians a letter grade based on how friendly they perceive them to be to the Second Amendment. So, someone like Donald Trump would get an A, and someone like, I think Hillary Clinton last time, got an F. So it's a way of trying to convince their voters to vote a certain way or for a certain candidate based on the issue they are organizing about. And then also political action committees. And so this election, during this election season, when you see these political ads come on TV, and it'll be like, vote for so and so, yada, yada, yada. And then at the bottom and at the end of the ad, they say, this ad was paid for Citizens for Social Justice or something like that. That's your interest group. That's your political action committee interest group that has organized this campaign, and so it's part of election law is that they have to be identified so you know who is paying for this ad that you're seeing. And so political action committees can be formed for any reason. So let's say that you are, and they have really obscure names sometimes. Like you may see something that's like, vote for this candidate because they support the Second Amendment and they're a patriot and yada, yada, yada. And this ad was paid for by Citizens for Patriotic Americans. And so it doesn't really tell you much about the group, but you can assume that they're probably conservative, they're probably Republican, things like that. But they sometimes have these obscure names where it kind of hides exactly who they are. But political action committees can exist to fund individuals, parties, specific issues, any of that kind of stuff. And if you look over here, this is from the book, but sorry, it's a little tiny. Um, this shows how much political action committees spent in the 2014 midterm election, and it tells you what field they're from over here. So far and away, our ideological or single issue groups spend the most money, 65 million in Texas elections in 2014. Single issue could be anything from gun rights to abortion to whatever it is, but they are ideological issues, things that are heavily correlated to liberalism and conservatism. Next would be, let's see, real estate. So real estate lobbyists lobbying for, lower regulations or, whatever it is for their field, allowing real estate agents to make more money. So this is what the American voter is contending with, is this amount of money being spent in election cycles. Um, so some techniques that interest groups use to try and influence, the getting people to support particular causes, to vote a certain way. Public interest or public relations is a good one. Most of your very well established interest groups are going to have a really good public relations, whether it's their media presence, TV, radio, social media, disseminating information. Um, that groups are good at this, especially well organized interest groups. Like if you look at I just use the NRA as an example because they are very well organized. They even have their own station or their own television media outlet called NRA TV, where they have people who have shows about gun rights and things like that. And so they are very much on top of like using media outreach to reach people. Um, and a lot of this is, for smaller groups, this is what we call grassroots lobbying. For smaller groups, sometimes that action looks like writing letters and emails to elected officials, knocking on people's doors to try and inform them about upcoming issues, starting phone lists, things like that. Those are techniques that groups can use. And then other groups like your NAACP, like we talked about, use litigation. If they fail to prevent something from becoming a law and they think that that law is unjust and unconstitutional, they can file lawsuits in the court system, provide legal representation to people who are a party to that case, and then those cases can work their way all the way up to the Supreme Court and overturn laws in our country. A lot of interest groups will also file what are called amicus curiae briefs. If a particular case is being considered at the court in the court system, they'll file briefs to the judges and justices explaining why they should rule a certain way, lay out constitutional arguments, all that kind of stuff as well. Now, regulating interest groups is something that could be better in the state of Texas. Texas' first attempt to regulate interest groups was what we call the Lobby Control Act of 1907. It was intended to prohibit influencing the outcome of legislation by any means other than appeal to reason. So the only thing you could do is just present a good argument to a legislator. Lobbyists could be fined or jailed for engaging in any other form of lobbying, but unfortunately, this act was just never enforced. And so, what we did in 1957 is we created a commission, the Texas Ethics Commission, that requires lobbyists to report their activities so we can track it. So, the TEC, enforces the regulations of interest groups and lobbying, and candidates have to report, what they are receiving from lobbyists, money that's being spent, things like that. Lobbyists have to register with the TEC if they spend more than $500 per quarter on expenses related to lobbying. Officials must report anything more than a combined amount of $1,000 per quarter. So, what does this look like? Well, it is illegal for any organization to give politicians money directly. That is a bribe. They cannot do that. What they can do is, give them, nice benefits and amenities. So let's say that your corporation is lobbying for a certain piece of legislation, and you want to lobby all the, the legislators that may be open to your point of view. So what you do is you get a box at the Rangers game at the stadium, one of the sky boxes overlooking the stadium, and you invite all the legislators, and you pay for all the food and the drinks and all that kind of stuff. And while they're there, you talk to them about, your legislation and what you want to see happen. That is legal. Now, most people would not consider that any different than a bribe, but the regulations that govern lobbying do. So they can do that type of thing. They cannot give them cash money directly. But let's say, they find out that you're a huge, fan of something. They can get you tickets to that, or they can organize dinners and cocktail hours and all that kind of stuff and invite you to those things. They can fly you out to certain places and things like that. Now, most people, that's still bribery, but they are not giving the elected official cash directly. So that is allowed, but they all have to report that this is happening. There are currently, probably more than this now, but there are currently over 1,400 registered lobbyists in the state of Texas. Political action committees have to register with the Texas Ethics Commission. And the biggest criticism of the Texas Ethics Commission is that it does a great job of keeping track of all this information, but it doesn't do a good job of enforcing the law or enforcing regulations and punishing people when they violate these laws. Now, like we said, the private interest groups with large membership bases tend to be more successful because they have more resources, more volunteers. Public groups deal with what we call, we talked about the free rider problem. When we talked about grassroots grassroots organizing, that is when it is real people out there in the world working for change. The opposite of that is what we call astroturfing. Astroturfing is when it looks like a group has strong support, but it turns out to be fake or purchased. There was an instance, I don't know if y'all remember, it was a few years ago, maybe maybe it was around like 2015, where there was this whole big deal in Texas about which bathroom trans people were going to use. And cities all over the state were having city council meetings, talking about putting restrictions on bathrooms and all this kind of stuff. And I forget what city it was, but it was up here in North Texas. And so the city council was meeting to discuss this issue, and all these people showed up wearing, the same T-shirt that said, like no trans people in bathrooms, yada yada, whatever the shirt said, I can't remember. And so it looked like, there was this room full of people at the city council meeting, advocating for this issue. But then after the fact, when reporters started looking into this, they found out that many of these people that showed up actually didn't even live in this town. They were essentially recruited and paid to show up to make it look like there was more opposition to this than there actually was. That's what we call astroturf, because it's not real. It's fake support to make it look like there is a stronger feeling about a certain issue than there actually is. But things that make interest groups successful: good leadership and organization. Most successful groups are led by former legislators, people who have served in government, people who know the ins and outs of the governmental process. Geographic distribution, having influence in all regions of the state or all regions of the country, you're likely to have a bigger membership base and a greater likelihood of success because you have more voices speaking out. Money, unfortunately, like we said, you need resources to do this kind of work. Political parties. Political parties, if they adopt those issues into their party platform, those issues get amplified by the influence of political parties. So, like, abortion is a good example. Being pro choice is definitely more aligned with Democrats. Being pro life is more aligned with Republicans, and they talk about that issue a lot. So, if you are a group advocating for those issues, you already have the support of the political parties. And then the professionalism of the legislature. The argument against lobbying is that if you pay your legislators well, they're more insulated and less likely to, succumb to corruption. Unfortunately, we haven't seen that to be the case, but that is a theory that is out there. I just don't buy into it. And then one thing that makes government susceptible to interest groups is what we call the fragmented government structure. Is that, power is split up among so many different agencies in Texas, and we'll talk about this more in some other chapters, that it makes it easy for interest groups to target those agencies directly. So we have, if we have like the Texas Commission on Environmental Quality, they can be targeted by oil and gas companies specifically for lower regulation, for education, any of these things. We split the executive power up into different agencies rather than it be centralized in one person. Conflict arises when agencies exist to regulate a specific area, but essentially they have been lobbied so heavily and so successfully that they don't do that well anymore. And we call that agency capture. And this is a good example of this is if we look at President Trump's administration. The person, I cannot remember the individual's name off the top of my head, but the person that President Trump appointed to head the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency, used to be a CEO of an oil and gas company. That's agency capture, because now we have put somebody who does not believe in the purpose of the agency in charge of it. Another good example would be Betsy DeVos. She doesn't believe in public education, yet she's in charge of the Department of Education. She does not have the best interest at heart when it comes to your student loans and things like that. So that's what happens. And this is kind of what this graphic over here represents. It's called the Iron Triangle Theory. So this shows the relationship between different parts of government and interest groups and how they essentially get into government and get influence. So we have our interest group here. They provide whether it's through political action committees or whatever, electoral support to people who are running for Congress. Once those people get elected to Congress, then in return for that support, they give funding and political support to particular issues that those groups cared about. The bureaucracy are the agencies that regulate those fields. So this would be like your Department of Education, your EPA, stuff like that. And then because of the influence from Congress, they are giving low regulation and special favors to interest groups who support those particular issues. And then the inside kind of shows, that going around the other way as well. But this is how interest groups get embedded in politics and in government to influence things that, again, sometimes are not always in the best interest of the people.